Have you ever wondered if your techniques are fast enough or effective? If you've been studying the martial arts for any length of time, you've probably been trying to figure that out yourself, whether it be for self-defense or sport. In this episode, we're going to start covering the economy of motion with your techniques. Stay tuned, we'll talk about it. Welcome to Shihan's Dojo. I'm Shihan Marty Husband, and we're here today to help you build your martial arts, or if you're wanting to take it, to better understand the martial arts itself. So if you want to build up your knowledge and skill in the martial arts, this is the place you should be. So jab that subscribe button and punch that bell so we can notify you when we have new videos coming out. Our weekly question this week is, how do you practice your economy of motion with your techniques? Let us know in the comments down there so we can start up a discussion about it. Economy of motion is something that has been argued for a long time, from Bruce Lee all the way up to the current UFC championships they have today. Many people have a grasp and understanding of what is being economical with their techniques and movement, and often think of foregoing the understanding of the old classical martial arts. Classical martial arts movements and techniques actually hold the idea of the economy of motion. But with the changes over the years that are taught, it is mostly a demonstrative technique for sport or to show off. This can be a real problem when teaching the students. Basically, when the martial arts is introduced to the public, it was used as a form of control and a way to impress people that were watching them. Despite what people believe today, there is quite a lot of economy in motion that has been set forth and done in these techniques, and the idea of them have been lost over the years due to the implication of sports and just trying to look good. One of the most impressive things that you can study in the Japanese martial arts and Okinawan is a process called Taisen, which means same time counter and attack. It's also known as the slip in Jeet Kune Do. This is not to mistake it that it's a parry and block with a 1-2 kind of feeling, but it is actually a strike at the same time you're parrying and maybe dodging with your head to keep from getting hit if you miss the parry. Number one is make sure that when you're using a technique, you do not telegraph its intention. First, make sure your techniques go from point A to point B, and second, study the shortest distance or route that your technique can take. When you're doing this, be sure you understand what telegraphing is. Don't show where the derived power is coming from in the technique. In many cases, it's not how far you pull back to kick or punch, but the ability to put the power in the shortest distance accurately and effectively. I have seen many times that inexperienced students or fighters will often make extra movements right before they're applying their technique. One of the things I would do when you're practicing is take a video of yourself. Make sure you're not making some bouncing movements or just not anything extra that you don't know you're doing. Any little extra movement or action might actually give your opponent an idea that you're telegraphing. And in using a video, this will help you to correct any movements you might find that you or your coach might be missing. Following through with the closest technique allows a person to better control oncoming techniques that are being thrown at them. The trouble with people not checking their techniques and that is they don't exactly get to examine everything. They forget to look at their footwork patterns, what they're doing with their foot techniques, maybe how they're using their head, their eyes, whatever. Telegraphing can be very subtle, but good fighters will catch on it. There are so many things you can do while studying your techniques and being able to understand where the techniques are in relation to the movement and the actions that are being portrayed. I believe the old instructors from 100 years ago or more actually hit, dodged, and parried at the same time when they were defending themselves. This is shown a lot in their forms and katas, but I think that sports has obliterated some of the very useful techniques that were there. Number two is to study your footwork patterns and motions to make sure you're delivering the proper amount of power with each subtle movement you might do. One of my favorite techniques to use is a classical backstance that can be seen in Shihan Shodan and Pinyin Nidan in the Okinawan styles. Plus, it's one of my favorites, and I feel it's one of the most useful techniques for me today. The basic movement, as you can see, is a long back stance, which in reality is not very economical because of the way it's taught in sport. However, in studying these techniques from a standing position or a non-assuming position, you can actually see the hands themselves being able to do multiple techniques in that one movement of training. This does not even include the 1-2 attacks that you can do with the legs also at this point. Number three is basically understanding the primary targets that those techniques will be using as you're studying them. I find it interesting sometimes that people don't break down the actuality of a technique and only assume what they've been taught simply because that's the way it was given to them. It really doesn't matter what techniques you are using or you feel comfortable with, because you should apply the same principle to it as I'm doing with this technique here. You have to understand the process of this in order to really utilize the principles that are being taught with these techniques. Number 4 is basically make sure that these techniques you're working with are using the modern day standards of self-defense or attacks or anything that might be coming at you. Many people are taught the classical ways, and which isn't wrong to understand the history of it, but sometimes the classical applications themselves have very little meaning today. Number 5, when you are studying the martial arts, you have to have the audacity to ask one question: why? Why is very important in understanding each of these techniques you're trying to study. It's impossible for the human body to move in any other directions than what it was made for. And you have to understand these ranges to maintain power, speed, and mobility. There's a need to be able to deliberate each technique that the person is trying to do. It allows them to proliferate their own style that they use. The same thing happens in trying to understand how the feet are moving. The fighter has to understand basically, are they moving in, moving to the oblique, or if they have to, move backwards. It would just depend on the actions that are being thrown at them. So they have to be tested constantly. In doing the back stance, like I mentioned earlier in the katas that I like doing the 2 back stances in a row. As you can see here, this is helping me with a 1-2 punch and being able to get basically 6 techniques in at that point. Actually 7. But there's even more if I had carried it through. It's impossible to have an economy of motion if you're standing in a ready-to-fight stance. Instead, train yourself from a non-assuming position or a relaxed position. Once you get into a stance of self-defense or fighting, there's no real surprise for your technique. Surprise becomes your best friend, and a shorter movement can sometimes allow you to take better control of the opponent's attack. I used a similar principle when I was testing for my 6th degree black belt and held it as a part of my thesis as the economy of motion. It's interesting to note how many of the upper ranks in the classical styles never put 2 and 2 together. They might do it in their own formats, but never really understood how the techniques in these classical actions actually came together. It was also interesting to note how much action was in there that they had never thought of or seen before. Now, I think if they had gone back to some of the traditional karates, such as Okinawan karate, and understood Kyushu, pressure points, and that, they would have probably caught some of those. But many of the masters who came to America or Europe just held these things back. And I think it's interesting today to note that many of the older instructors today are going back to Okinawa and China just to figure out how these actions actually work with the nerve centers. Now, I'm not talking about magic karate or anything like that, but I am talking about actual attacks to nerves and body points. The one thing you got to realize in this with these types of actions, unless you train regularly, it will be impossible for you to always hit the right areas of the body. Although we're not covering nerve attacks at this point, it is here that each of these individual movements are striking important targets and nerve clusters. Then it can allow the person to use a finishing technique, whether it be a throw or some sort of punch or kick or whatever. Remember, this does take constant study if you want to become proficient in the ability not to waste your movement in a fight. It's not something you can do one time and always remember. It's something you'll have to do repetitively until it becomes second nature. So therefore, study your techniques. Check out their motion, how they're moving, what's reality, what's pushing it to a demonstrative level in sports. Get that feel in there. Number 6 is keep your fluidity of motion. Fluidity of motion is really something that I don't think is often stressed enough. I think some people out there think a fluid technique is like doing a simple 1-2 combination. It's not true. The fluidity of your technique has to be that when you are attacking, that you keep a constant move and that the technique that is used is able to follow without changing too much direction or the fluid direction that you're moving in. What I mean by that is if I'm coming in to you with a 1-2 and I stop, that is not a fluidity of motion. Fluidity of motion would be that I do a 1-2, continue doing a roundhouse from the leg, or just taking and continuing with the techniques until the fight is over. I think that's one thing that made Bruce Lee one of the greatest fighters to live in his time. And I think today it's one of the better reasons why a lot of these good fighters can stay at high levels. I'll try to talk about fluidity some other time, but just know that being able to move without any encumbrance and be able to continue to defend an attack without stopping and to be able to move consistently and non-stop in order to be able to be effective. Now there's a lot of people out there say, well, how do you do that? Again, That's by you completely training, going through each of the techniques that you've learned and seeing how they apply from one motion to the other. That was, I think, originally the purpose of some of the katas too, was to go from one transition to the next. The problem with that is if you see like in karate, that's a very hard style. The fluidity becomes lost simply because they lock and go to the next technique. That's not to say there's not fluidity in that. Once they learn how to do the lock and explode, which is almost instantaneous, it really takes them to the next advanced level. But lower ranked people don't often get this because it's not taught to them. Fluidity is more than just doing a 1 punch or a 2 punch or a 3 punch. It has to be trained and studied. It cannot be left alone on its own, because it's not just going to happen. I mean, if you've ever seen good kung fu, you will see that most of the time it doesn't stop, and when it does, it's usually a sign that they're changing directions or basically going on to a new opponent. The true actual applications of fluidity that were used in many of the old kung fu forms were basically counters to the counters to the counters. I mean, whenever somebody was attacking, they would counter, do an attack, assuming that person did a counter to your attack, you countered that attack, and it just went back and forth. I hope this has been some help. Don't forget to comment about the question we had earlier. How do you practice your economy of motion for your techniques? Let us get a conversation started so we can all find better ways of training. Also, don't hesitate to tell us what you'd like to see or any questions you might have. And we'll see you again here on Shihan's Dojo.